Good morning. Today is October 28th, 2024. And as part of our four-part series for contingent offers, this is part 3. I wanted to talk to you about Forms 44 and 46. What happens when the bumping offer arrives and that first buyer is actually going to either waive or satisfy. So last week, we talked about that second buyer coming in. Excuse me. And what happens when that second buyer takes over first buyer position. This week, I wanted to revisit the same scenario, but this time where buyer 1 actually waives or satisfies and continues to stay in the contract as first buyer. So let's review a couple things about the contingent offer process. The bumping offer is the choice of the seller. This means the seller can choose to bump an offer with another offer that has a contingency of any kind, including the home sale contingency. The bumping offer must have mutual acceptance with the second buyer addendum. This means that Form 39 that we discussed last week has to be signed around, mutually accepted, and the mutual acceptance date is based on the mutual acceptance of that Form 39 being signed. We're not going to confuse the second buyer addendum with a backup buyer because those have two completely different implications and consequences. The bump notice is only for use of 22B buyers. So you are not going to find yourself reaching for a bump notice in any other situation than when you have a 22B buyer. Once bumped, the status must be changed from contingent to the appropriate status. It could be pending inspection. It could be pending. Most likely during the process of this, it will go to pending. That offer, once waived, can no longer be bumped. So we are no longer going to be reaching for the bump notice if we have that bump notice satisfied or waived. A satisfying of the contingency carries it through its expiration. So when you satisfy the contingency for a 22B, then that contingency remains in place until everything within that contingency has been expired. Waiving that contingency removes it as if it never existed. It eliminates it. We don't want to confuse the idea of waiving a contingency with satisfying the contingency. Your 22B offer can be escalated in price by another 22B offer, or sorry, by a non-22B offer. But the 22B offer has to be, so the 22B offer, if in an escalation, can be the escalated offer that you choose to be escalated by a non-22B offer. But you can't use the 22B offer to escalate another buyer. Now, the 22B must obtain seller permission if they're going to accept another contingent offer that has either the 22B or Q, and that would be the contingent sale or the pending sale. Your 22B buyer has until the expiration of their contingency to keep trying to sell their home. The 22B buyer must continually try to sell their home on the Northwest MLS. It has to be done publicly on our Northwest MLS specifically. Your 22B buyer has until the end of the contingency to either satisfy or waive unless they are bumped. And the seller permission is required for offers that are accepted less than 30 days or over 45 days. So reviewing again really quick what the difference is between a backup buyer and a second buyer. A backup buyer is going to be a buyer that holds a backup position for a certain amount of time. The backup buyer does have the freedom to terminate that backup agreement if they have not been given notice. They are really under no obligation to take that first sale unless they haven't given notice and they have then been pushed into first buyer position. A second buyer is somebody who is specifically buying as a second buyer that is a bumping offer to be used with Form 22B. The second buyer is the addendum that you should be reaching for. If you have any 22B in your contract, do not reach for Form 38, reach for Form 39. So remember who can bump any other offer? Well, your seller can choose which offer they want to use to bump. And Let's talk about the Form 39. Who is responsible for initiating this? Now, we need to have this in place in order to use the bump form. So Form 39 is definitely a relevant form that we need to talk about while we're talking about Forms 44 and 46. So who does the initiation? Who's the one responsible for sending that second buyer addendum? Does that buyer who wants to be second buyer just put in their offer and the seller counteroffers? Does that buyer, knowing that there is already a contingent offer in place, just include it in the first place? How does that work, or does it even matter? Well, typically the seller will counteroffer with that bumping offer and include that 39. Because remember, there are some options in the Form 39 that maybe the seller might want to elect to add, like the removing of contingencies or the timeline for the bumping. But there's not really a rule surrounding this dictating who is responsible. So the fact is the seller cannot enter into a purchase and sale agreement bumping another buyer unless the 39 is included. But as far as who is responsible for putting that 39 in, there's no point of responsibility on this. There's no point person. Now, creating an offer that triggers the bump. Remember, in order to create that offer, we need to have a second buyer mutually accepted, signed around completely with their purchase and sale agreement, as well as the second buyer addendum, which will be the triggering factor for putting them into first buyer position. This addendum being signed, as well as the mutual acceptance of their offer in the first place, obligates them to be that second buyer. So think about this for a minute. A listing broker, their listing is under contract, under contingency, right? A contingent agreement. Another buyer wants to engage the listing broker to serve as their limited dual agent to bump the contingent agreement. Is this broker prohibited from serving as a limited dual agent for this second buyer? And think about who we represent and how this would play out. The listing broker of the offer with an accepted 22B has somebody approach them and says, I want to put an offer that'll bump your current offer out of the way. Are they allowed to do this? Well, this might surprise you, but so long as the listing broker is not a dual agent for that first buyer, then the listing broker may represent the second buyer. So, of course, this assumes that the listing broker will enter an agency agreement with that second buyer and still has to have all the necessary consents from both buyer and seller to be the limited dual agent. But there is nothing that prohibits that listing broker from representing a second or bumping buyer, as long as the broker does not also represent the first buyer. So think about this in a way that we have a listing and we have two interested buyers. The same rule applies. You get to pick one buyer you represent. You may not represent both buyers for the same listing. So how do you bump? Well, I already talked about having that first mutual acceptance with the second buyer addendum in place. But in order to actually trigger this bump now, we're going to send Form 44 over to the buyer. Form 44 is a notice that's given to buyer number 1 that says another offer has been accepted. It even says right here on line 5, the seller gives notice that the seller has accepted another offer to purchase the property as permitted by the sale of the property contingency addendum 22B. So this means the offer has already been accepted. This also means that this offer that has been accepted in order to use the bump has a closing date. Now, the buyer having received this is going to have two options. They will either be able to satisfy the contingency, which means they will have been able to sell their home within that bump period of time, or they can waive the contingency to close if they want to move forward. The buyer also does have that third option of saying, hey, I was never able to sell my house, but for this purpose today, we're talking about the buyers who are wanting to move forward and be the ones closing it. Once they receive this bump notice, all of the timelines set forth with this are done by 22B. If you look back in your 22B, you'll see the timelines that you've set aside for the buyer's response. No response from the buyer, again, is a declining of how do I want to say this? No response from the buyer means that they are not waiving the contingency, nor have they satisfied it. So in a non-response, the contract will automatically terminate and the earnest money should be awarded to the buyer. Again, check your 22B for all of your timelines. Let's think about this scenario. We had a contingent offer that is in first position with a home sale contingency that included a 3-day bump period, and that expires on October 17th. Okay, on Friday the 13th, that seller accepted a non-contingent offer and included Form 39 and served it to the first buyer on their bump notice, Form 44, on Friday the 13th. So this buyer had a 3-day response period based on their 22B. Their total home sale contingency expires on the 17th. We know Friday is the 13th. So in a 3-day calculation, we are not going to count weekends. The seller would like to know, can we move forward with the second buyer now? Or do we have to wait until 9 p.m. on the 18th when it expires to see if the first offer can satisfy and waive their contingency? This is all about computation of time. So don't let the rest of the facts of this question get you tripped up. The first buyer, they have the right to satisfy or waive that home sale contingency, and that right runs through 9 p.m. on October 18th. The seller cannot move on that second buyer until in first position until after 9 p.m. on the 18th, when that buyer does not satisfy or waive their home sale contingency. Bottom line is, we need to make sure we are giving that buyer their entire timeline to respond, because no action can be taken until that particular party does not perform. Okay, so buyer 1 wants to respond to the bump notice. How does that happen? Well, the buyer responds on Form 46. Form 46 is the bump notice response. I wanted to pull up paragraph 4. This is on 22B, and this is what tells us what the timelines back and forth are going to be for these bump notices. Paragraph 4 is the property remains on the market paragraph, meaning this property is going to stay contingent until being bumped or being waived or satisfied. Now, if a bump notice is served, in line 41, it dictates how long the buyer has back and forth to respond to those bump notices. It defaults to 5 days. So if you don't want to give that buyer of yours 5 days to respond to the bump, this is where you would change it. Again, that's Form 22B. So the buyer wants to respond, but in our situation, because we've already talked about what happens when the buyer doesn't want to move forward, we're going to talk about how they do move forward. Buyer responds with using Form 46, which is the bump response. Everything in the first 4 lines is stated and matched up with the rest of the contract that the buyer is a part of. Buyer will select the first option, property sold, contingency satisfied, if they truly do have a mutually accepted contract with a closing date. This means even if they had permission, if they got a contingent offer, they are not able to satisfy that contingency yet until a closing date has been established. And we all know contingent offers do not have an established closing date. So this would be for a buyer's offer that is received with a closing date. Now, when the buyer chooses to satisfy the contingency because they've accepted an offer within this bump period of time, it is required that the buyer attaches the purchase and sale agreement to this bump notice. So when things come through the office, I will be checking to make sure that the offer was in fact attached to the bump notice. Doing this also gives the seller kind of an awareness of the offer that was accepted. Keep in mind, there are times that the buyer has to get permission from the seller in order to avoid some consequences. I will talk about those consequences in more depth with next week's class, but if a buyer has accepted an offer and it needed the seller's permission, this is where the seller would be notified of that happening. So be careful, buyers, of accepting offers without permission that you're not allowed to accept. We're not going to talk about the bottom two because I talked about those last week. So this would be the situation where you'd say, I have sold my home, I'm ready to move forward. The other option, if they have not sold their home, would be just to waive the contingency altogether, and they could still move towards closing. That would be option 2 right here. So if they have not sold the house but still want to waive and close because they have other means of closing, option 2 would be in its place. Remember, anytime there's a satisfaction of the contingency, that protection of that home selling and any other protections that still remain will still follow that buyer until they've been exhausted. If the buyer chooses option 2, the property is not sold, but they are waiving the contingency, then that is the removal of all protections of this sale not closing. The buyer will in fact waive all contingencies that are a part of this purchase and sale agreement, and they need to be closing the house. If they should not close for any reason, earnest money would be awarded to the seller because they have no contractual protection. Now, when does the buyer need to get permission in order to avoid some of these big consequences? Well, on 22B, paragraph 2, it actually spells out when permission is needed. So permission is needed from the seller if that buyer on a 22B purchase is going to be accepting a contingent sale on their contingent sale. If they are going to be accepting an offer that closes before 30 days or longer than 45 days. Now, this does include 22B and 22Qs. So if a buyer on 22B is accepting an offer that has any sort of pending sale necessary in order to do so, they do need permission. Now, the consequence of not getting the permission is not the most detrimental thing in this contract. However, you are leaving your buyer up for some serious consequences still. If the buyer does not get permission to accept one of these two types of offers by using Form 90L, getting permission on 90L, then the buyer is going to be leaving themselves open for the option of the seller to terminate this contract. And if the seller chooses to terminate because the buyer didn't get permission when they were required to, within 3 days of learning this, then the buyer is going to be losing their earnest money to the seller because they did not follow the protocol that they said they would in 22B. Okay, so buyer number 1 has decided I am definitely moving forward with this. Now, what do we do about buyer number 2 who's been sitting and waiting with their second buyer addendum? How is that second buyer going to know that anything has been happening during this bump period? Well, we do need to notify buyer number 2, and we do that with Form 39N. That is the second buyer addendum notice. The notice to the second buyer tells you exactly how the first buyer responded to the bump notice. There are only 2 options on this. Either the first buyer is moving forward, waiving or satisfying, or the first buyer is saying, nope, I'm not going to do this. And hey, second buyer, you are now first buyer. We need to notify second buyer regardless of first buyer's decision. So this form is always going to be used if we have a second buyer addendum in our purchase and sale agreement. Remember, we just check one of these 2 boxes. I hope this was able to help kind of move you forward on how to accept or move forward on a contingency if you are first buyer getting a bump notice. Next week, we'll talk about how to give notice, how to ask for permissions, and kind of go through some other scenario-based situations that may help you in your endeavors. Thanks for listening.